I think, they'd be the most experienced journalists in the Pacific dealing with reporting on coups. In Fiji, it wasn't the case because, in fact, many of the middle-order experienced journalists had left since 1987. So it was like a learning experience all over again.
Expats or native-born Fijians?
No, Fiji journalists. Right. You get the impression that because Fiji Times and so on, it's News Corp owned and Australian expatriate published and that sort of thing, the journalists, rank and file journalists, they're Fiji journalists. And many are quite talented. But when you have the vast majority of journalists that are quite young, I remember doing research, and it was actually a report that was done in 2004, which showed that 49% of journalists in Fiji actually did not have any kind of real training. If you compare that with, say, New Zealand, where journalists have to have essentially a diploma or degree before they even get into the ground floor in a newsroom. In Fiji, most journalists are school leavers, and the complexity of the political system and high school doesn't really prepare most journalists, unless you're absolutely really gifted and you ride through all this anyway.
Well, then on the other hand, you had that extraordinary recommendation from the Fiji Human Rights Commission, which recommended that, that non-Fijian journalists should not be allowed to work in Fiji. Where did that come from?
Well, there's been a long history of, I think, resentment in some quarters in Fiji, because it's easy to blame the media, it's easy to blame the expatriate publishers and so on. But if you compare it, say, with Papua New Guinea, for example, where the main newspaper is also owned by Murdoch's News Corp, they had indigenous Papua New Guinean editor way back in 69, I think it was, and they've always had indigenous editors ever since, and many on the board of directors are also Papua New Guinean. And so there's always been a bit of a contrast with Fiji, because Fiji is used as sort of like a training ground for its, emerging sort of publishers and executives. They make a success with Fiji, make a good profit, and then off to another.
It's very lively. I mean, a lot of the journos up there went to train last year, some of them, but they have to work incredibly hard just to get even basic information now. And so their role is so much more important than what it ever was before. People rely on them. And what's happening now is that I talked to a journalist last week, a Fijian journalist. Now, that journalist has stopped working for an international organisation that he used to string for because he says it's just not worth his safety. That's what it's got down to. I mean, they still work hard in Fiji and they still do the stories, but there's so much pressure on them now.
And I wonder if, as a consequence of that, you've seen it go underground, because I've been looking at the Fijian side, the blogs of the respective sides. We thought the blogosphere was vicious here. It's extraordinary. It's a pitched battle out there. It has the debate that maybe could have been going on in the mainstream media.
It doesn't matter what side of the fence you sit on, it's pretty vicious, it really is.
You must look at this differently as well. There are certain media organisations in Fiji who have political affiliations, full stop, and that includes television, newspaper, radio. They have political affiliation, either side of the fence, right? But by having that affiliation, you are definitely going to get two sides. And that's why I think when you look at what Barbara is saying, that certain journalists are coming out of the professions they don't want to be in anymore, it's probably because of the others. Because of a set few, everybody gets to be in the same situation. So I think you've got to understand about how media works in Fiji and what the current media is doing to the interim government, and how some
are seeing doing to the interim government.
Well,
you mean they're being hostile?
There's this continuous issue of being against the interim government, and the interim government feels nobody listens to them. That's if you talk to them, they'll say, "Oh, nobody
can't get them to talk."
Nobody listens to them. Exactly. There's the irony of the whole thing. Yeah. Fiji TV, for example. What do you think? What's happening with Fiji TV? What's your perception?
They work so hard to try and get those people to comment. I mean, sometimes, and they've received all sorts of threats and on their home phones and all sorts of things. This is the environment they have to work on. I think they do their best. But what's happening is, because they, in a way, generate that fear, is when they go to a court sitting, for example, they will report it word for word for word. So the public can't actually understand what's on that piece, because they're so scared about getting it wrong that they make it incredibly complicated. So that's another problem that they're facing.
I want to pick up the point that you made before about the blogs, because in fact quite a few of those blogs are actually done by journalists. And it's sort of become, particularly last year, it became something of a safety
style to the pros.
And then you get this irony that you've even got the regime or the interim government, the IG blog that's been set up by a journalist in the name of the regime and so on, and it gets incredibly vitriolic. And there have been reprisals. I remember at one point the USP Journalism School had sort of a kickback because they were believed to be connected with one of the blogs. Untrue, actually, but there's that climate of repression, so journalists feel that in some ways, well, they've got their very public media exposure, but the blogs sometimes actually they can get a story out on the.
We'll pick up that point about the media climate. We have to take a break now, but we will be back in a minute with more Pacific complexity.